So a very, very good morning, everyone. Yes. Uh, louder. Okay. So a very good morning, everyone who are here in the audience and who are tuning in via our Facebook event page. My name is Aisley, and I am the guest curator for this ongoing exhibition titled Illuminated Curiosities. It's taking place simultaneously across the campuses of Imasi Nam Long and Imasi Vạn Phúc in Ho Chi Minh City, and it's a collaborative effort between the Nguyen Art Foundation and the Lenting Foundation. And with this exhibition, the curatorial team, namely myself, Dương Mạnh Hung, who is in the audience today, and Thâm Nguyen, wants to explore the intersectional spectrum between art and science via a selection of 46 artworks from 26 Vietnamese and regional artists. And the show will be on view for 6 months from May until December this year. And during this period, a series of public program activities will be organized, including curatorial tours, workshops, and seminars. And today marks the very first seminar to kickstart this series. And I am thrilled to introduce to you two distinguished guests with us today. The first guest, I think she needs no introduction, but just to follow the script, Professor Nora Taylor is interim provost at Fulbright University, Vietnam, and professor of South and Southeast Asian art at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. She is also the author of Painters in Hanoi, an ethnography of Vietnamese art, and I think it's one of the most important titles on Vietnamese art history. And for the past 10 years, Dr. Taylor has also served on the advisory board of Asia Art Archive. And good evening, Andrew, who is tuning in from Chicago. Thank you so much for staying up this late for us today. And Dr. Andrew Yang works across the visual arts, natural sciences, and expanded research. His projects have been exhibited from Oklahoma to Yokohama, including the 14th Istanbul Biennial, the Museum of Contemporary Art Chicago, the Spencer Museum of Art, and the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. His writings can be found in Leonardo, Biological Theory, Art Journal, as well as the recent Handbook of Art, Science, and Technology Studies, and also Kinship, Belonging in a World of Relations. Yang was inaugural artist in residence at Yale-NUS College in Singapore, my dear old college, and curatorial fellow at the Center for Humans and Nature, and is also a professor at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. And thank you for joining us, Andrew. As for the agenda for today, it's very straightforward. For the first half, we'll be listening to Dr. Yang's presentation titled Crossing the Imaginary Chasms, Art at the Intersections with Science. And for the second half, Dr. Taylor will be moderating a panel discussion among us, and with, of course, Q&As from the audience, both here and via our Facebook page. So without further ado, the stage is yours, Andrew.
Thank you so much, Ace, and I want to thank you and Hong Yong and Nora Taylor, and of course the Nguyen Art Foundation for having me today. Really appreciate it. And so I want to. Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me? Okay. Sounds like
yes.
Good. I want to address some of the questions that are brought up by this really engaging exhibition, Illuminated Curiosities, and then also the title for today that was offered by the curators, this idea of crossing the imaginary chasms of art and science. So I'll open up with just some reflections on the question of the art and science intersection, and then try to sort of bring some of those to light, talking about just a few of my projects. And so at first I wanted to start with this photograph. In a way, you could call it a self-portrait. And you could say that there's a gap, or perhaps a chasm, in this image between the Earth and the Earthlings that took this photo when they landed on the moon in 1972. But at the same time, I think what's interesting about this picture is that there's also an inherent relation. Not only is there the fact that the Earth and the moon are eternally bound to each other through gravitational attraction, but the moon itself was born from the Earth. It's moon rock, it's Earth rock that has been broken away by a massive impact that happened, 4.5 billion years ago. So in this way, this picture is actually a very complex self-portrait that represents physical relation, material kinship, and an intimately shared family history all at the same time. And I think that this is maybe an analogy to the inextricable relationship between art and science as well. Two realms that were, in one sense, always were once united, but are now seen as distinct, but are in fact always tied together. One can always see the other from rising above its own horizon. So I think that's one of the themes too in Illuminated Curiosities. So this is an image from a book called The Analysis of Sensation by the scientist and philosopher Ernst Mach, who's the namesake of Mach speed, the concept of a certain speed. And what's so interesting to me about this self-portrait in this case is that it's one where he doesn't take his own body for granted. It isn't a self-portrait taken in a mirror depicting one's self in reflection. It's taken from the point of view from their own body. And he represents his body. You can see his nose, his mustache, his hands holding the pencil that he's ostensibly drawing this picture with. And he's representing his own personal point of view in relation to the rest of the world that he's observing. So I think that this is an important image because in this way, Mach makes his and also our familiar relationship with the rest of the world kind of actually more complex and less obvious by giving this very certain kind of embodied perspective. And so I said it makes it less obvious. And I want to say that, this is certainly, I think, again, an important characteristic often of what we think about when we think about artistic practice or scientific practice is that, we tend to use these phrases, obviously, this, or naturally, this. And I think the question is anything actually obvious or is anything actually natural? And if so, how are they? And I think this is something that certainly, Claude Levi-Strauss, the famous anthropologist, has brought up in regards to the question science, right? The scientist is not a person who gives the right answers. He's the one, or she is the one, who asks the right questions. And so we have this relationship about what is obvious. If we look at this picture now, not of a moonrise, but of a sunrise, for thousands of years, humans knew that obviously the sun and indeed the whole cosmos revolved around the Earth, that we were the center of the universe. All one needs to do is look at the sun from sunrise to sunset, and it's very obvious, right? It wasn't until Nicholas Copernicus rethought the celestial observations that others had made that led to a completely different worldview that upended, right? That for Earthlings, they were no longer the center of the universe, but they were brought down to Earth from a very particular point of view. Maybe a view from one's own either personal body or earthly body, like Gaia. I'd also say, though, another name for this desire to not take things for granted, to not assume the obvious or the natural, to inquire and to investigate and to explore is curiosity, and hence, illuminated curiosities as well. And I really appreciate this quote by the author, American author James Baldwin, who I think expresses this sentiment especially well in regards to art, right? The artist cannot and must not take anything for granted, but must drive to the heart of every answer and express the question the answer hides. So in this, I see a reciprocity in Levi-Strauss's, characterization also of the scientist, right? We talk about exposing the question hidden by the answers. Exposing is a revealing, a motivation and intention to discover that's both common to science and art. And it is about the complex relationship between the questions and their answers, or the answers and their questions. So to embrace this is also, this kind of curiosity, I think, is also to embrace the anomalous within the ordinary, not as errors or aberrations in the world as we assume the world to be, but as new clues to how the world actually is. And this brings in, I think, also very well the idea of the cabinet of curiosities and what these historically helped do sort of between the Renaissance and the Enlightenment period. The very time when Earth lost its place in the center of the universe. It's in the midst of the Copernican revolution that these Wunderkammer or Kunstkammer in the German-speaking countries were appearing. And this one is of Ole Worm, a Dutch collector. These collections were meant to sort of reveal a new reality of how things relate to each other, especially humans to the self and also to the more than human world. So change one's mind, and in the process then, change the universe itself. So in terms of such natural history collections, the first cabinets evolved then into museums. And I want to mention in this regard an American painter named Charles Willson Peale. So for you, those of you who don't know Charles Peale, he's famous for his portraits of American statesmen. He very famous portrait of George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and many early Americans. But he also, as we can see in this self-portrait, curious about curiosities and in natural history. And in this case, he's holding the leg bone of a mastodon, an extinct relative of the elephant that was discovered in Ohio. In fact, Peale, a painter, funded and led one of the first natural history expeditions at all in the United States in 1801, and in which this mastodon skeleton was exhumed. And this led this mastodon, along with many other collections of objects, led to, this is a portrait, by the way, of the excavation of the mastodon, led to the first museum in the United States, the Peale Museum, that Charles Peale put together. And this is his self-portrait, in which art, science, archaeology, history are all presented together, not as distinct disciplines, but in this holistic view. And you can see that mastodon bone right there, right next to his left leg, and then right behind the curtain, the full mastodon skeleton. And so here you have this sense of him, of course, revealing this sense of discovery in the metaphor of him raising the curtain to everything that's sort of behind the scene. And so there's this possibility of seeing what's there, but in a transformed way. And this is not just for himself or individually, but for people more broadly. And that's the importance of these cabinets, but also what came later, the museum. To the extent that these collections did show the power, the wealth of an individual, that always has to be acknowledged, that there's a lot of dynamics of economics and power in these collections. They were also sincerely, in many cases, serving the purpose to educate and to illuminate and make accessible new forms of understanding that were emerging at that time, and to give people the opportunity to see for themselves. And so that's what Peale expressed about the self-portrait when asked to describe it. It was not only to make a lasting monument of his own art as a painter, so you see, of course, that he won't neglect his own importance, but that I bring forth into public view the beauties of nature and art, the rise and progress of the museum. And so this gesture towards the museum as a place of public discovery and of discourse is really important. And this is where art and science, I think, find a common cause also. It is in the question of not beauty as much as what I would say is aesthetics. Aesthetics is often used as a synonym these days for beauty, but the origin of the word in the Greek is actually aesthetikos, to be aware, to perceive. And it's this cultivation of awareness and perception through close observation and representation that I think is really the beating heart of both art and science practices, and what keeps them unique and in special relationship to each other, kind of locked in a mutual orbit. Even though they go about these things socially in very different ways and methodologically, they share the question of aesthetics. And this is, I would say, the core to my own work as I attempt to learn about the universe and share it with others. Sometimes I call myself a scientist, in other contexts I'd be an artist, but in either way, I'm really trying to sort of engage these questions and answers much in the same way I would like to think that some of the early natural historians might have in their own way. Now, this is a picture of Chicago from above, my hometown. So in urban centers, the ability to see at whatever time of day is a priority. And here the buildings and the streets you can see are lit up as brightly as you can imagine. City people want to see everything at all times. They want to move around at all hours. They want to know what's in front of them. However, in exchange for this, they also lose sight, that's to say actual visibility of what their larger context is. Because as Earthlings on a planet among billions of planets and stars and galaxies, that's actually visibly inaccessible to us. If you look up at the night sky in Chicago, you can see nothing but perhaps 2 or 3 of the brightest stars and some planets, and a regular line of airplanes overhead. So this light gives people a sense of discovery in one sense, but it's not discovery, it's really safety, it's visibility, it's creating a world where there is actually no real night. And in exchange for this visibility, for the things immediately around us, we lose our awareness and perception of those things more generally around us. So as one of the most light polluted cities in North America, Chicago is actually a lot like the rest of the country. So this is a image from the International Dark Sky Association that shows the same vantage during a normally lit evening, and then during the blackout that struck Canada and the east coast of the US in 2003. And so here we've got an anomaly. We've got a natural experiment where all of a sudden, all of the lights, without anyone's choice, are cut off. The people you can see in this house have a generator, so they have lights within inside their house, but all of the ambient light that we're generating constantly is suddenly gone. And all of a sudden you see what? You see the universe, you see the Milky Way, you find your own place among all of these other places in the cosmos. But now, including my own child, is probably the first generation that doesn't have access to the night sky. More than 50 people live in urban centers with significant light pollution and don't actually know literally where they are in the cosmos. This is a really nice picture of the Milky Way. So I want to share this real small clip that relates to a work that I did along this theme.
A handful of sand contains about 10,000 grains, more than the total number of stars we can see with the naked eye on a clear night. But the number of stars we can see is only the tiniest fraction of the number of stars that are. What we see at night is the merest smattering of the nearest stars, with a few more distant bright stars thrown in for good measure. Meanwhile, the cosmos is rich beyond measure. The total number of stars in the universe is larger than all the grains of sand on all the beaches of the planet Earth.
So that's Carl Sagan with the opening line from his TV show Cosmos. And he raises quite dramatically and poetically this analogy of the idea that there's more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the planet Earth. It turns out Carl Sagan was wrong. The best estimate is that there's actually 10 times more stars in the universe than there are grains of sand on the planet Earth from our latest best estimates. But that's all to say there's this sense of scale. And so I was reading a storybook to my daughter when she was around 3 years old. And in one of the pictures, there are all these sort of collage dots in a night sky. And she asked what all the dots were. And I said, well, of course, that's the starry sky. And she's like, what are you talking about? I've never seen stars like that. And I got to think about the light pollution concern, and I decided to I had an opportunity to do a series of works for the Museum of Contemporary Art in Chicago. And this was one of the anchoring works of that exhibition, which is called A Beach for Carl Sagan. So I take Carl Sagan's metaphor of 1 grain of sand for every star, and I actually do it for basically the Milky Way that you can't see in Chicago. The Milky Way is composed of about 200 billion stars, and this is 200 billion grains of sand. I can go into detail if you want to know how I counted or estimated that, but this 7 tons of sand pretty accurately reflects the number of stars that otherwise you could see, but you can't. But they're shaped in the pattern of the sand dunes that you might find along Lake Michigan. You can see them, they're a beach. They represent the thing that is otherwise invisible, in the city itself. There's some other components to this that are both audio and video that I won't discuss, but I just wanted to tie in this idea. Here's some of the radios hanging from the ceiling playing the cosmic microwave background. There's actually, every radio, FM radio, it turns out, is actually a radio telescope. And 1% of that white noise that you hear is the sound of the Big Bang. That's for another conversation. In this exhibition, I also had a piece called The Makeshift Geologies, or The Way Within. One thing that's really interesting about the way we think about the universe and the terrestrial versus the extraterrestrial is that when a meteorite lands or something like that, we think it's so special, right? Because it's something from out there. And so this idea of our relationship and this, disjunct we have between the earthly and the cosmological is something I was really interested in. And so I made gathered in some cases made, in other cases gathered different objects that are actually all completely also unique in the universe. There's no single rock that you can find on the ground that's like any other rock on this planet, much less any other. They're all completely unique aesthetic moments. And so this idea that we might cherish a meteorite that lands is kind of strange when in fact everything on Earth has this utter uniqueness. Now, some of these stones, it turns out, are collected. Some of these stones I've made out of paper and painted with watercolor. And in some ways, it's hard to tell the difference. One of them, I think you can tell, is an old juice box that I found on the ground. And so this idea of observing, of discernment, of play, of wondering what something is, and is it unique? And in what ways? If it's unique, is it special? And what does that specialness even mean to us? Is some of the things that I'm playing with in this collection of what I consider to be unique objects in the universe. For example, the left one is paper and the right one is rock. Part of this exhibition was also 2 videos called Interviews with the Milky Way. And I interviewed 2 parts of the Milky Way that I thought would be really interesting to engage. One was an astrophysicist named Jeff Oishi. If there's time, I can show you a clip of the interview I did with him and sort of the visual play around interpreting what he was saying as he reflected on the Milky Way. But then I also interviewed my own mother because she is also an equally authentic, interesting part of the galaxy knowing itself, just as much as a astrophysicist might be. And so we talk about, of course, her own experiences looking at the stars, her childhood, our relationship. We bring in the universal and the personal into this certain kind of intersection. This diptych was also in that exhibition. It's called Placenta Lava, and it shows just simply a photograph of the placenta that my daughter and my wife created together during her pregnancy that I was able to take a photo of at the hospital. And then a rock that my partner is carrying, a lava rock that she's holding in Hawaii on the day that we found out that she actually was pregnant. And so there's, of course, a moment of intersection, but there's also this interesting visual analogy between both of these looking both organic and geological at the same time, and also representing 2 things that are actually intimately connected. I mean, there's plenty of iron in that placenta, and there's iron in the basalt, in the rocks, and maybe not in this particular basalt, but there's a materiality. And I think it's important to recognize, if we're going to recognize ourselves as part of the universe, that means recognizing our deep materiality as well, in addition to the immaterial things that we find so meaningful. And so in that spirit, I also did this piece called Stella Stoichiometry. Stella is my daughter's name, which means star. And stoichiometry is just a word for how the technique in chemistry where you balance an equation. You can turn something into something else by equalizing the number of atoms and their kinds on either side of an equation. And so what I did in this portrait is I collected the exact number of oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, phosphorus, calcium atoms that composed her body at her birth weight of 6 pounds and 13 ounces, but found them in other materials. So it took a lot of stoichiometry or math, but these jars of water, of canola oil, of oyster shell, of sugar, of rock candy and arginine powder actually represent the exact chemical composition of my daughter, just in a different arrangement. And here you can see some of the ways the equation balances out. And so I'm very interested in this idea of what science can bring to represent and make visible certain aspects of our own personal lives, but then of course the contradictions and weird, uncomfortable things that brings up for ourselves as material creatures. as things that, of course, come from the universe and will return to the wider universe at other times. I had an opportunity to redo the portrait 7 years later for an exhibition. This is in 2019, and so I did stella stoichiometry, all things renewed, at 40 pounds, which was her current weight at that time when she was 7. But I made it out of slightly different materials. But this represents this 40 pounds of yellow chalk, of coal, of vodka, and Legos actually, again, account atom for atom for the very atoms that compose her body, just in a different arrangement and presented in a different way, but are materially equivalent. And so that raises, of course, like I said, this question between what does it mean for something to have a special arrangement? What is the chasm or the gap between what organizes something as material and then what gives them form and gives them characteristics that, of course, we cherish and see in immaterial ways. And these are pictures of her at those two respective ages. And then quickly, I'm just going to pivot and close my talk to say, part of this interest in trying to reconcile and make sense of at the same time the material and immaterial nature of things, and I think, again, this is something that art and science share in common, is our need to, therefore, in a weird way, imagine on an ongoing basis. One has to hold themselves in a state of suspense, right? The curiosity is also a state of a lack of resolution, of constant imagination about what things are, but also what things could be. And so I think one place that you might find something in terms of curiosities, but also in terms of where art and science intersect in that area of aesthetics as a center of knowledge that takes aesthetics as a priority, are actually botanical gardens and arboretums. So I've been starting to do more work. This was at the invitation of the Los Angeles County Arboretum and Botanic Garden, and I sort of did a study and intervention in their library. Now, the LA Arboretum is known for a TV show that was really popular in America in the early 1980s called Fantasy Island. I don't know if any of you ever watched this television show with Ricardo Montalban. But what was interesting, of course, was the suspension of reality in this case, too, of the things that you would hope would happen, and then, of course, the unintended consequences of the thing you wish for not always turning out the way you want them to. So the LA Arboretum is the site of the filming of Fantasy Island. And the arboretums themselves are sites where, of course, a lot of landscapes were imagined and created. California, so much Southern California as a desert, was turned into basically a analog of Australia and certain parts of the Pacific by bringing plants from all over the world and cultivating them in a new landscape. And so this idea of color correcting the landscape, of imagining Southern California as another place, is something that I took upon as a subject of study as I went through the library books and their discontinued books, and taking those materials and collaging them and recombining and thinking, again, in a sort of fantastic way about how aesthetics finds its home in a place like an arboretum, but specifically the library, which of course is where all of the scientific books are organized carefully and are supposed to be sort of organized in a very pristine way. So I would make collages from these books that they allowed me to tear up, because they're constantly getting rid of old books and renewing them with new ones, that played off of this idea of, again, visual analogy, of wonder, of curiosity, of things that look like other things, and the things that are themselves just beautiful in their own right, and try to find these other kinds of intersections, things that close a certain gap. And then did an exhibition in the space of the library itself. In this case, this tree of knowledge is a bunch of books that they were discarding, that I did a series of these sculptures that turned the books themselves back into the trees that the books, through their paper, actually, of course, originally came from anyway. And then took some of those books and composted them over periods of weeks to see how the books would be transformed in their return back into soil, feeding on other forms of life. And then in closing, I'll just say I won't show much of this work, but this work was extended in a artist residency that myself and my partner Krista Donner did in Singapore in 2020. that was specifically looking at the idea of the garden and Singapore as a garden city, as a way to think about this question of fantasy of art and science. In the course we taught called Culturing Nature, we had our art students making observations through microscopes, drawing through them, collaging, creating scenes at different scales that were, again, engaging in research and aesthetics, intuition, and abstraction sort of simultaneously. And one of these exercises we do actually is sensory, where they have to trust each other to lead each other on these blind walks where each person's eyes are closed and the other person leads them through a touch tour of a space that otherwise is familiar to them, but which they can't navigate necessarily on their own in this new way in which they're lacking their usual sight. This is just a video showing this exercise during one of our classes. You can see that they go in pairs or triplets. And it's about this idea of, again, a point of view. In this case, not a visual point of view, but a sensory point of view, right? And again, that's what aesthetics is about. It's about awareness and perception, but it isn't just about vision. It's about, of course, the sonic. It's about the haptic and what you touch. It's about what you taste and what you smell. And sensitizing students to thinking about this in a different way and what aesthetics constitutes as part of our art practice, and then how they themselves in relationship can collaborate in ways that involve trust and vulnerability that is even sometimes unique for very individualized art practices. And then I'll leave there. I'll just say, if you're interested, I also do a lot of work. This is some of the pictures of just some of the work that we also did on gardens in Singapore, but I won't go into it for right now. But if you're interested, I also do curation that's on these themes. There was recently at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, myself and Giovanni Alloy, an art historian, curated Earthly Observatory with over 30 artists, international artists, that looked at these questions of ecology, observation, and aesthetics, and also another exhibition that you can find online at makingkin.net called Making Kin, Worlds Becoming, with all of these different themes that engage, I think, art and science in hopefully useful ways. So thank you for your time, and I really look forward to the conversation we have now with Ace, Laura.
Thank you, Andy. Esther? Yeah. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and thank you for illuminating some of these concepts, the intersections between art and science. So I want to start with how you started. You started with a self-portrait. I thought that was really brilliant way to begin a conversation about art and science, because of course we as humans, this is how we encounter the world and feel the world and view the world and experience the world with our own bodies and selves and so forth. But maybe you could go into a little bit of a autobiography and maybe just narrate a little bit about when you saw yourself exploring both art and science, either together or separately, or maybe bring us back to that illumination for yourself.
Yeah, well, I'm just, the largest thing to say to start that off, be very brief, is that I've been just very lucky. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a rural part of New England. Both of my parents are scientists, but I had free rein to sort of interact with animals and ponds, and I got to have the opportunity to interact with the natural world, while at the same time always drawing or just ceramics. I always had an interest in art, but they were always coupled with natural history or science or engagement with nature in this other way. When I entered college, I tried to double major in science and art. But at one point I had to make a choice because all of the studios ran at the same time as the science labs, and I literally couldn't do both. And so, one day in a drawing class, my teacher said, if you want, you might want to pursue art And I was like, oh, is that because I'm really good at drawing or something? And she's like, no, you're actually the only one still drawing 2 hours after class. I think you've got the dedication to be an artist. But if you have to choose, I would start getting your formal science education. And maybe you can come back to art, because it's much harder to have a formal education in science. It's harder to do that later. And I did take her advice. I continued studying science all throughout graduate school, but I always worked with advisors and worked in laboratories that were focused on genetics. The lab I studied in at Duke University for biology was an evolution of form lab, and my advisor made his name explaining how butterfly wing patterns evolved over millions of years. So, and he himself was an artist. And so when I graduated with my art degree, or sorry, my science degree, I actually made a very considered choice to apply to work at schools of art and design, because I wanted to have those as my peers and as my colleagues. Those are the people I actually feel a lot of solidarity and affinity with. And I was always making art. And anyway, so in SAIC, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, really gave me an opportunity to re-engage with that community, and then of course pursue my MFA degree and have this mixed practice. But it's been a very unique opportunity to have that. There aren't many schools of art, of course, that have science professors. I feel very lucky to be able to pursue it.
Yeah, it is unusual, and yet you make it seem so natural to use that word that you use, and obvious. And it's interesting because I know that I grew up where math and science were seen as certain part of the brains are used. You know, kids are told almost that you have a brain for science or you have a brain for art. And sometimes the art part was not viewed as positively. You know, it was for people who were not as skilled or able to memorize or calculate and so forth. So, and even the School of the Art Institute, we often showcase people like Eugenia Chang or yourself who can make these intersections between art and science, but also who can teach artists, you know, about science. But it sometimes insinuates that artists are not capable of grasping science in some way.
Yeah, which is I find so disturbing. And you know, some of the best scientists I know, of course, are artists, and it's certainly true among the students that we have. And that's where I feel very lucky in having the chance. And they have that curiosity. It isn't about memorizing it and getting an A on the test. It comes from this very authentic place of engagement. You know, in high school, I did very poorly generally on my grades in science, and I excelled in literature and visual art. But I was part of this science club that forced you to do your own independent science project, and we'd go to science fairs. And it did very well in these science fairs if I had my own project to develop over time and research. And so that's what got me into science in college. I think if I hadn't had this science club I was a part of that got me interested in research individually and thinking about those intersections, I would never have gotten in to study science at the university level.
Yeah, thank you. So the next point I would like to make, or unless Ace, you had something to add to that, is about museums. You brought up museums, which is really interesting because that's how, of course, where we encounter art, of course, art museums, but then also natural history museums. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about any investigation that you've done on displays, curation, or because you talked a little bit about the history of natural history museums, but what about art museums? Or what else can you say about what we have done as humans with museums? Because there's a lot of talk, of course, about, you know, restitution now, or about, you know, white cube spaces, or, you know, contemporary art, Asian art, you know, in museums and so forth. So maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, wow, we could talk for hours. I mean, I'm really interested in museums of these sites. I have a fairly large scale long-term project called Flying Gardens of Maybe that involves both the Smithsonian and the Field Museum of Natural History. And that's actually about birds and bird ecology. But what I really enjoy in engaging with scientists in museums is that we have shared interests, but we are pursuing them in such different ways. And they're taken by surprise by that particular project because I need their expertise to help me know what birds are and the seeds in their stomachs that I end up growing as gardens and these flower pots that I make out of ceramics. And it creates these really unexpected moments of curiosity even for them. Things that they think are strange at one moment then become really interesting to them in another. And that also happens to me in learning more about their research. Now, the question about the art in the Science Museum, it's interesting because, you know, when you see that cabinet of curiosity that I showed, some early art museums, of course, also were these cluttered salon style, very elaborate, overly stuffed places. And you know, it's interesting how the visual culture of the art museum and of science continue to parallel each other into then the modernist moment where then the white cube is really not that different from a science lab or from looking through a microscope at a slide with a specimen completely isolated for your uninterrupted view. And so there's some writing that I haven't done any projects that look specifically and unpacking the museum in that way. I usually use it as material, but there's a number of essays I've written about questions of the museum and about the scientific gaze and the artistic gaze and ways in which they parallel in places where they diverge. So, and then I'll leave there. I'll just say, if you're interested, I also do a lot of work. This is some of the pictures of just some of the work that we also did on gardens in Singapore, but I won't go into it for right now. But if you're interested, I also do curation that's on these themes. There was recently at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, myself and Giovanni Alloy, an art historian, curated Earthly Observatory with over 30 artists, international artists that looked at these questions of ecology, observation, and aesthetics, and also another exhibition that you can find online at makingkin.net called Making Kin, Worlds Becoming, with all of these different themes that engage, I think, art and science in hopefully useful ways. So thank you for your time, and I really look forward to the conversation we have now with Ace Laura.
Thank you, Andy. Can I start? Yeah. Thank you so much. I learned a lot, and thank you for illuminating some of these concepts, the intersections between art and science. So I want to start with how you started. You started with a self-portrait. I thought that was really brilliant way to begin a conversation about art and science, because of course we as humans, this is how we encounter the world and feel the world and view the world and experience the world with our own bodies and selves and so forth. But maybe you could go into a little bit of a autobiography and maybe just narrate a little bit about when you saw yourself exploring both art and science, either together or separately, or maybe bring us back to that illumination for yourself.
Yeah, well, you know, I'm just the largest thing to say to start that off, you know, to be very brief, is that I've been just very lucky. And I was lucky enough to grow up in a rural part of New England. Both of my parents are scientists, but I had free reign to sort of interact with animals and ponds, and I got to have the opportunity to interact with the natural world, while at the same time always drawing or doing ceramics. I always had an interest in art, but they were always coupled with natural history or science or engagement with nature in this other way. When I entered college, you know, I tried to double major in science and art. But at one point I had to make a choice because all of the studios ran at the same time as the science labs. And I literally couldn't do both. And so, you know, one day in a drawing class, my teacher asked said, you know, if you want, you might want to pursue art. And I was like, oh, is that because I'm really good at drawing or something? And she's like, no, you're actually the only one still drawing 2 hours after class. I think you've got the dedication to be an artist. But if you have to choose, I would start getting your formal science education. And maybe you can come back to art, because it's much harder to have a formal education in science. It's harder to do that later. And I did take her advice. I continued studying science all throughout graduate school, but I always worked with advisors and worked in laboratories that were focused on genetics. The lab I studied in at Duke University for biology was an evolution of form lab, and my advisor made his name explaining how butterfly wing patterns evolved over millions of years. So, and he himself was an artist. And so when I graduated with my my science degree, I actually made a very considered choice to apply to work at schools of art and design, because I wanted to have those as my peers and as my colleagues. Those are the people I actually feel a lot of solidarity and affinity with. And I was always making art. And anyway, so in SAIC, School of the Art Institute of Chicago, really gave me an opportunity to re-engage with that community, and then of course pursue my MFA degree and have this mixed practice. But it's been a very unique opportunity to have that. There aren't many schools of art, of course, that have science professors. I feel very lucky to be able to pursue it.
Yeah, it is unusual, and yet you make it seem so natural to use that word that you use, and obvious. And it's interesting because I know that I grew up where math and science were seen as certain part of the brains are used. You know, kids are told almost that you have a brain for science or you have a brain for art. And sometimes the art part was not viewed as positively. You know, it was for people who were not as skilled or able to memorize or calculate and so forth. So and even the School of the Art Institute, we often showcase people like Eugenia Chang or yourself who can make these intersections between art and science, but also who can teach artists, you know, about science. But it sometimes insinuates that artists are not capable of grasping science in some way.
Yeah, which I find so disturbing. And you know, some of the best scientists I know, of course, are artists, and it's certainly true among the students that we have. And that's where I feel very lucky in having the chance. And they have that curiosity. It isn't about memorizing it and getting an A on the test. It comes from this very authentic place of engagement. You know, in high school, I did very poorly generally on my grades in science, and I excelled in literature and visual art. But I was part of this science club that forced you to do your own independent science project, and we'd go to science fairs. And it did very well in these science fairs if I had my own project to develop over time and research. And so that's what got me into science in college. I think if I hadn't had this science club I was a part of that got me interested in research individually and thinking about those intersections, I would never have gotten in to study science at the university level.
Yeah, thank you. So the next point I would like to make, unless Ace, you had something to add to that, is about museums. You brought up museums, which is really interesting because that's how, of course, where we encounter art, of course, art museums, but then also natural history museums. And I'm wondering if you could say a bit more about any investigation that you've done on displays, curation, or because you talked a little bit about the history of natural history museums, but what about art museums? Or what else can you say about what we have done as humans with museums? Because there's a lot of talk, of course, about, you know, restitution now, or about, you know, white cube spaces, or, you know, contemporary art, Asian art, you know, in museums and so forth. So maybe you can talk a bit more about that.
Yeah, wow, we could talk for hours. I mean, I'm really interested in museums of as these sites, I have a fairly large scale long-term project called Flying Gardens of Maybe that involves both the Smithsonian and the Field Museum of Natural History. And that's actually about birds and bird ecology. But what I really enjoy in engaging with scientists in museums is that we have shared interests, but we are pursuing them in such different ways. And they're taken by surprise by that particular project because I need their expertise to help me know what birds are and the seeds in their stomachs that I end up growing as gardens and these flower pots that I make out of ceramics. And it creates these really unexpected moments of curiosity even for them. Things that they think are strange at one moment then become really interesting to them in another. And that also happens to me in learning more about their research. Now, the question about the art in the Science Museum, it's interesting because, you know, when you see that cabinet of curiosity that I showed, some early art museums, of course, also were these cluttered salon style, very elaborate, overly stuffed places. And, you know, it's interesting how the visual culture of the art museum and of science continue to parallel each other into then the modernist moment where then the white cube is really not that different from a science lab or from looking through a microscope at a slide with a specimen completely isolated for your uninterrupted view. And so there's some writing that I haven't done any projects that look specifically and unpacking the museum in that way. I usually use as material, but there's a number of essays I've written about questions of the museum and about the scientific gaze and the artistic gaze and ways in which they parallel in places where they diverge. So.
Yeah, and it reminds me also of how we think of museums as, okay, not only decontextualizing everything, you know, removing it from its context, and certainly when we exhibit ancient statues from Asia, let's say, as one example, but the artifice of a museum. And it's interesting because you're also working with botanic gardens and especially looking at Singapore as well as this place of hyper artifice, you know, where nature is contained, as the title of Tim Barnard's book. And then, you know, I also co-edited that special issue of Antenna where we were trying to unpack some of this idea of containment and, you know, how humans try to contain nature, and especially in Singapore.
Isn't it interesting that when artists, and you'll hear a curator and artist talk about cultivating, right, an aesthetic, or they're cultivated, and of course it comes from the agricultural, it's a metaphor for growing something, for either in a field or in a garden. So this idea that I think that it is interesting, it is about control, but it's also about nurturing in a very controlled and contained way. So yeah, and the other point you bring up is just, you know, luckily, both art museums and natural history museums are also trying to take more responsibility and account for, of course, the ways in which we try to universalize these paintings, these objects, these artifacts, these biological samples. But of course, they have their own place and their own point of view too, right? And so there's a tension in the museum, and I think hopefully that shows up in some of my projects too, between what we consider the universal and the personal. And how do you take proper account of the desire of trying to have a universal understanding when you really have to, of course, recognize that everything is embodied and everything is personal and everything is cultural. And you can take something out of its context, and that can be really enlightening and illuminating. And it's important for knowledge formation, but there's a violence to that decontextualization. And so how can you treat objects like subjects in their own right? How can you avoid as much of that violence as possible and allow things to have multiple contexts at once? I think that's the real challenge for art and science museums, and of course art and science and culture today overall.
Yeah, and finally, I was thinking a lot about, as you were talking about matter and materiality, and but I really liked that image of the placenta and the lava rock, because it's what I think of science making visible, the invisible. Like if you have a microscope, you can suddenly see cells that you can't see with the naked eye. But of course, art does that too. Artists show you what you don't see normally, or they make you see something that you would overlook or you wouldn't have seen.
Exactly.
Yeah, if the artist hadn't pointed out to you. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and so that's what's so amazing when you go to a museum and you see a sculpture or painting and you have that moment of discovery of something that you took for granted and for so long, and that the artist presents to you and represents to you in a way that makes you aware. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know, Ace, maybe you have something you want to add to the discussion?
Sure. Thank you, Andrew, for so much information, so much interest, so many interesting things to kind of unpack in your presentation. I was particularly intrigued by Stella's stoichiometry, and I think you mentioned about kinship in the beginning with that analogy with the moon and the earth, and the moon coming from the earth in this material kinship relationship and all. And I think as human beings, we also have that same material / biological kinship with nature and the universe, and it fits in with that entire politics of the universal versus the personal you just talked about. And it goes back to that conversation about Singapore as well, being just this super artificial place. I mean, I've been there for 20 years, and it's surrounded by nature, and it's the country with the densest, with the most number of species, natural species in the same square meter,
really?
actually.
Yeah.
So actually, naturally, there's so much to see beyond such artifice. They import a lot of all these species in as well. There are a lot of native species to unearth and just to observe. And it reminds me of that Chicago light pollution photo that you showed as well, that we kind of want to just surround ourselves with familiar and artificial things to kind of just feel the familiar, the unfamiliar and the unknown. But that's the real aesthetics, as you laid out, right? Is to be aware of, the bigger world. And I think just sometimes we forget about that bigger picture when we want to just be in our own comfort zone. So that politics of aesthetics is really interesting.
I look forward sometime to talking to both of you more about most of I didn't show most of the work that includes sound work from Singapore, but a lot of it is also still in development because we were at the residency during the beginning of the pandemic. And so I'm actually still working through a lot of the material collected there and a lot of those ideas. And so I would really value having a chance, given your time in Singapore, and Nora, to talk to you about all of those themes you just laid out much more.
It's interesting. I read an article someone wrote about COVID in Vietnam and Ho Chi Minh City, and was talking about invisibility too. And then it made me think that, of course, it started with the fact that a virus, of course, is something we can't see, right? So and you're a biologist, so you understand viruses, but then went on to what one sees and how humans have behaved in Ho Chi Minh City and how the city has changed. And so I was thinking about ecologies that brought on by the pandemic, but also just in general. Singapore and Ho Chi Minh City couldn't be more different, but there's some similarities in it, trying to contain something, trying to, there's this rapid development that happening in Southeast Asia. There's alarming pollution, and of course, everybody's talking about climate change and all of these things. But it's like nature still takes over. We're in monsoon season. You can't stop the rain, that's for sure. But you can stop pollution, presumably, but you can't stop development. And right now, and so it's interesting.
Yeah, I would love to talk to you more about my experience in Singapore during that, what they call the anthropause as a more general thing, right? And how because a lot of the work we did was actually interviewing gardeners of all kinds, guerrilla gardeners, permaculturalists, landscapers. And so we've got this series of interviews that we're trying to distill that are different people giving these other perspectives on Singapore as a garden or as an untamed garden than during the pandemic, because no one was cutting the grass. Um, and what happened in such a short period of time to the city.
Oh, that's interesting that no one's cutting the grass. For Singapore, that's an alarming idea. They must have freaked out to see grass taller than an inch. No, things are much more chaotic in Ho Chi Minh City. But I last weekend I was in the Mekong River in this city called Kanta, and it's, you know, seeing these markets where farmers are bringing all of this fruit to the main market, tons and tons and tons. And then those things get distributed throughout the country, throughout the world. I mean, in Chicago, you can find durian and jackfruit that probably comes from the Mekong Delta. So I know that wasn't part of your talk, but I was just thinking, you were thinking about the universal,
that's right,
global
I just saw giant jackfruit in my local grocery store at Chile yesterday. I've been there before, and they must, of course, be from Southeast Asia.
Yeah, of course. And you can get huge ones here. They're everywhere. Yeah. Should we turn to questions, or do you have anything else?
I have one last one for Andrew. So we talked about colonizing nature just now. I mean, at least our efforts to. I think I detected a little bit of eco-feminist stance in your works. I'm not sure if I'm right, but maybe a little bit of Donna Haraway or Jason Moore.
Yeah, certainly. I'm a big fan of Donna Haraway. I use a lot of her writings in my own collection. So yeah, there's things there that are very kindred in terms of a sensibility and an approach. And the way in which I really appreciate the way Donna Haraway is able to be so complex and so exuberant at the same time in her writing and in the way she approaches the question. There are so many left turns, then right turns, then you turn around and you come back. And in that sort of confusion, then you get this whole new clarity. And so I think her work also is meaningful for so many artists. But of course, since she was a historian of science and started out as a scientist and then a historian of science, and then of course now an ecofeminist scholar, I really find a lot of fun in her work and her approach.
Should we turn to the audience? Are there questions from the audience?
Yes, there's a question from an online audience in Lucknow, and she asks, thanks to our foundation for organizing the talk with Andrew. And
can you hear this, Andrew?
No, sorry.
Yeah. Do you want me to?
Yes. So the question is just.
You want me to read it?
Yes.
Okay.
So,
Okay. So Lucknow asks, thanks the Nguyen Art Foundation for organizing the talk, which is very fascinating. And there's a question, would you mind sharing a bit about the process of calculating the sand and comparing it with the Milky Way? Yes. Yeah. Oh, thank you, Lucknow, for asking that burning question that we were all wanted to know.
Well, I'll just quickly, it's funny, but obviously if you've ever held sand in your hand, the same grains of sand vary greatly in their size, but the size in stars are actually just as diverse. And so so what's an average grain of sand? What I basically had to do was I found a certain brand of sand, quickcrete clay sand that sort of standardized, and I counted tens of thousands of grains of sand, and then in different sets of 1,000 I would weigh them, And then I would, of course, come up with an average. And so I came up with, after counting tens or probably hundreds of thousands of grains of sand and averaging that for this brand of sand, you know, on average, this much, 1 kilogram of sand is this many grains. And I use that calibration curve to come up then with the I think it ends up being in that one installation, it was 6.25 tons, or that's about 13 to 14,000 pounds of sand to make the 2 billion grains. But it's a plus or minus. But what's okay about that is our estimate of the number of stars in the galaxy are also plus or minus, you know, tens of billions. So my estimate doesn't fall too far off from the way astronomers also have to estimate.
Okay, there's another question from Nguyen Long. I think it's Bill. Thank you, Andrew, for such a fruitful presentation. You've helped to shine light on a different aspect of what it means to be human-centric. And instead of putting our material and consumptive needs at the center, we can indeed reserve that spot for our need for the curious learning and discovery of the world surrounding us, of which we are a part.
Wow,
so it's not a question, more like a comment. Yeah.
That's so beautifully put. If you can send that to me.
Yeah, we'll send that. I'll send it to you. Okay, there's some others. Okay, so Bill continues with a question. Actually, I didn't scroll down on this phone. Andrew, your commentary on the similarity between the scientific lab and the space of the white cube in terms of their supposedly shared architecture, function, and the distance they put in between the subjects in study and the users/observers really struck my mind. In relation to a quote from the book Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds, and Shape Our Futures by the biologist Merlin Sheldrake, which states, composers make decomposers unmake. And unless decomposers unmake, there isn't anything that composers can't make with. What do you think is the work of art, the artist, and the art space? Is it decomposing or composing? Is it putting extra distance or bringing different knowledges together? As an artist and curator yourself, can you share some of the artistic curatorial strategies you've used to deal with this issue?
Oh, wow. Yeah. Those are the great questions. And yeah, I think ideally they are both. It's composing and decomposing. And I think that, you know, and I think with our aesthetics, we also think of addition, but then the question is like, what about subtraction? But that's where I'll just say, I showed a few, but that's where a lot of my work, one of my strategies as an artist, I'll say, is I think conceptually, I'm basically working collage. And sometimes the collage is with magazines and papers and textbooks where you juxtapose things from different sources and put them in new relation. But sometimes those are with also, of course, objects or ideas as well. And so it's trying to create a new relationship for the sake of hopefully insight. And so there's inherent in that those components are ingredients, right? And so that is where composition and decomposition happens. It's not just an analogy to say that happens in the biological world, as Merlin Sheldrake really puts it so well in that book. It's the material reality, and that's where the stellostoichiometry, of course, piece comes up too, of this tension between the composition and the decomposition, and in what form brings, right, something about the human form in that case, and the cells and the molecules of life basically initiate something that can't happen otherwise on its own in those glass jars so inertly. But anyway, but as an artist and as a curatorial strategy, yeah, I mean, I think it's just, again, not to make sure that you're always paying attention to how the arrow works both ways. And so in Earthly Observatory, we actually had worm bins. We wanted to have active decomposition in the gallery. And the sound of those worms, that was a piece by Paul Dickinson, that were then amplified from microphones into the gallery space. And that's sort of what was at play in the decomposition book that I showed too. There was one other thing I was going to say, but now I'm going to forget. But yeah, I mean, I wanted to mention, I try to articulate this a little bit in the essay that I have, you can find online, but is in the Routledge book, where I talk about the idea of mesoaesthetics, meso being in the middle, like meso. So in the middle of something, it's called in the middle of something, mesoaesthetics. And it starts off with the famous Charles and Ray Eames film Powers of 10 that takes place in Chicago and about the scientific view, but then also the artistic view and how it's always at a distance. And the entanglements are not obvious and with those visual norms and conventions. And so I talk about mesoaesthetics as entangled aesthetics. How can you always be in the middle of something without necessarily being viewing from above or below, but being a part of something where, even for a scientist, you have to acknowledge your subjectivity. There is no real objectivity. There is no view from a distance. You're always connected to something. And so I try to cash out some of those ideas in that essay, if people are interested in it, if Bill or others are interested in that.
Okay, thank you. I think there are some other questions. Thank you. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, so Nyung Walsh, actually, who's in Chicago right now, says, thanks, Professor Yang. How did your daughter react when she learned about the placenta work, if she's aware of it now, and if you could share?
Yeah, well, she finds it a little bit absurd. She has a good sense of humor about it, but she kind of also kind of gently mocks me, like, oh, so this is what contemporary art is, huh? It's just putting things like sugar and oil together. So I think she's seen that work in different circumstances. She isn't self-conscious about it in a negative way. I think she finds it really interesting, and it's helped her embrace her own senses. And my partner too, the work. She doesn't see it as gross or disarming. I think she finds it as something that is weird and strange. And she herself does a lot of art, and she's always asking me the question, "Is this art?" To which I say, "That's a really good question."
Yeah, that's a good question to ask.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay, so there's another one from Hong in the audience. So this is also a question about Stella's stoichiometry. Sorry, I can't pronounce that word. I feel that intimacy plays an important part in this work of yours. Intimacy where the body is a site of meeting between chemistry and art, but also the act of deconstructing your own child seems a tad violent in its own sense. As you contemplate on how violence is permeated through decontextualization, how do you think intimacy factors into the liminal intersections between art and science in your creative process?
Wow. So I don't know if I can answer the second part, but maybe I can try to by saying something about the Stella stoichiometry. So as I talked about that project, and of course it was with the placenta lava photo diptych that you mentioned, and then there's this interview with my own mother. And so I think one thing I came to actually understand about those interconnected projects was that it was very much about me reflecting on the creative power of the female body. The mother who gave birth to me through mother's milk, and that's why it's called the Milky Way, because it looks like spilled mother's milk. My own partner who's able to create this other person in this whole form that I never can. And the best that I can do is this somewhat pathetic gesture to construct her from these other things that I can calculate and find at the grocery store. I don't have the generative power to help create another person, much less create the relationship. And that's what's so interesting about the placenta, is this interface between two completely different but completely connected individuals, going back to this idea of relationality. And so I understood those projects as me trying to make sense, and I think feel a humility, of course, around the fact that myself as both a biological male, but also as an artist, these are really small gestures that are helping me think through and kind of both be in awe of and grateful for these other embodied generative powers that I don't possess, but again, that I'm part of, like as I'm connected, of course, to my mother, to my partner, and to my own child. And they're not, of course, mine in that sense, but yeah, so back to that, that's how I'm working through it. And that's, again, this tension between the personal and the universal, and what one has control over, and what one can try to gesture through, and what I have to then, in doing that, I acknowledge I have no control over and no power over. I can't create a form as articulated and remarkable as a child, but I can make those sculptures. And they're so ham-fisted, they're so simplified, they're so reductive, and there is a violence in that. And so I'm glad that that's recognized, because it should be seen, those sculptures should be seen, I think, in a way that is somewhat, melancholic, somewhat sad. It isn't, it's both a celebration of all the things that make a human, that clearly are not about the material, right? That must extend beyond just ingredients. It's about organization and form and self, and that, but there's limits. And so the human limitation, and the artist's and the scientist's limitation, in what they can actually really create.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, I think giving birth, having done it myself, is a violent act in itself. But
Yeah.
I think that and the poor child who's safe and inside the womb suddenly gets,
they cry the moment you throw them into this world.
In this world, and have to live a full life in this world. But I like this idea of intimacy too, because I feel like whereas much of what you've been sharing really shows the intersections between art and science, but intimacy is something I feel like I'm not sure I would associate intimacy with science at all, but with art, definitely, constantly. I mean, artists show their intimate feelings and ideas and so forth. And yet, I feel like your work does make us look at science in a different way, and think about something like intimacy or personhood, but personhood from a different angle, not just biological, but even if it's biological, there's something profoundly intimate about a placenta, for sure. So,
and even the scientists who might study it, though, I hope I'm not unique in that way, and I hope that the scientists that I meet and these natural historians, they have that sense of intimacy about the organisms that they study, and I think that's what's so interesting. They have to speak in the third person and speak in this sort of authoritative or universal voice, but they have very deep and personal commitments. That's why they've devoted their whole lives to studying these birds or this roundworm or that mushroom. And so I think there's something there that often people don't get to see if they're not in the sciences, that's neglected, which is this deep sense of intimacy and connection to a creature. There's a very interesting book by the anthropologist Sherry Turkle called Evocative Objects. I don't know, but she interviews scientists about an object that is really meaningful to them and was part of what got them also interested in the sciences, but also staying with the sciences. And some of these objects are obvious, like a computer, but some of them are completely unexpected. And it's a very interesting small book of just interviews about these evocative objects. And in them, you really get that sense of intimacy. You really see what the scientist is really connecting to, as opposed to rationalizing or analyzing. It always starts with this connection.
Yeah, we're kind of like the art historian. It's not, we're not artists, but yet we can become so intimately involved with the subjects that we're studying. And so, that's really interesting. Afterwards, I don't want us to end this session without us talking about, is it bees that you studied? No, what did you, ants? You studied ants.
Yeah, I used to study ants, yeah.
Because for the audience knows, when you gave a presentation when you went up for tenure at the School of the Art Institute, and I think it was about your scientific work more than your artistic practice. So that was interesting.
Yeah.
Okay, we have someone in the audience, Cho Nguyen. Thank you for your time. Could you elaborate more on the role of technology in your work with regards to the projected neutrality of technology in the arts? Does technology transform the subject? Does it change it in any way? Or is equilibrium the general goal you have in mind when creating your work?
Oh,
Additionally,
wow.
Haraway and Munoz both speak of time and hybridity. Do you think your use of technology transcends the time encoded in your material in any shape or form? And what is your idea of hybridity between art and science?
Wow. We should have a longer conversation. I would love to hear their own idea. The fact that they asked these questions, I want to hear their ideas on this too, because I can't address that all. But the technology question is interesting because the question is technology an extension of the human? Is it like a prosthetic? Or is it something in its own right that has its own agency? And I think, one thing I will say that you might have noticed about most of my work, and that was true even as I was a scientist, is it's very low tech. All of these things I can do with my hand. I've never used anything more complicated than a video projector or a microscope or some tweezers. And so when I have been engaging the sciences or materials, I'm trying to point out that they're very lo-fi, like the stellar stoichiometry, all those things I could buy at the grocery store. Another project I recently did about geology and books, they're all books that are coming out of the waste stream. That were being discarded and thrown away. And that's true of the bird project at the Natural History Museum. I actually take the stomachs and the guts of the birds that otherwise are disposed of. And so my own practice, I think, is probably like intentionally low tech, because I want to see what's possible with the limitation of just thinking about things as ingredients and often also engaging what we consider waste. And recomposing the decomposed or the thing that's set aside. But I think there's really interesting questions around the technology, but I think my own personal aesthetic is I shy away from that. I'll use, again, computers and animation or video, but you will notice in most of my projects, those aren't engaged explicitly as technologies in the projects or as instruments in the projects themselves. It really tries to focus on the hand or the body or on manual or non-electronic sort of instruments. So, but it's a much larger conversation, really interesting conversation.
Joe is in the audience. I don't know if you want to add to that or... Okay. I don't know if you want to sit here.
Oh my God.
Okay. Yeah. Go ahead. So you can at least see an audience member.
Oh, hi.
Hi. Thanks for answering that question because I'm really curious about the way you work and especially the way that you view science as, I think, a kind of prism to look at the world with curiosity and with like a certain sense of innocence. And I really appreciate that when I look at the work, and like sometimes it shows in your community setting kind of projects, and it shows when like in the kind of patience that you have in executing your projects. But regarding the conversation about technology, because I'm also in it, and we just have like this sort of ongoing conversation about neutrality, especially for me because I'm a non-white and like female presenting person. And so there is that kind of neutrality that is also about access. That asks like, whether I have the privilege to enter it at all, whether it is available to me, whether I can be neutral about it. And I think for you that's less relevant because because of the kind of tools that you choose specifically. So I have like that's one of the questions that I have for you.
Yeah, no, and thank you. And you mentioned in the question this whole other concept that I'd love to talk to you about this term you mentioned, equilibrium, and things being in equilibrium. So we should talk about that sometime. But Yeah, you'll notice I try to use tools that, again, might mimic the sense of an early Renaissance natural historian, where they make their own, and I did that in my own PhD research. I often would make my own simple instruments to do a task, and they're custom made. But this question about neutrality in technology is really interesting. And actually, I would just refer you, if you're interested, Cho, to also look at Sherry Turkle's work, because she, as an anthropologist, she engages some of those questions about technology and neutrality, and also I think some questions also around gender, and how, especially, of course, gender plays a role in the way people engage with technology, but also scientific investigation. So, but they're all really live questions. Yeah.
I think this question of technology is very different from what you're doing, because you're asking questions, and so it's not so much about demonstrating how something can be done. Sometimes I think of technology as a hindrance, like it's there's too much equipment or sort of prowess of what it is trying to accomplish, but it's removed from the actual question. That's what I think, but I might be wrong.
And or I think I take a very primitive approach to what technology. Like, to me, a book is technology, in a very profound way. And so, but maybe that gets back to the mention of Haraway and Ace's thing. This idea of the cyborg, and even the way Donna Haraway engages the question of technology through the hybridity of the cyborg. But I think what's interesting in that case is even the technologies that Haraway mentions are often not high tech, they're low tech, and that helps you actually understand the principles of what technology really means to us. What does it mean to be a cyborg? You probably don't want to start that conversation talking about artificial intelligence or virtual reality. It's better to talk about that conversation with Marshall McLuhan in the printing press or the book or the computer, in these other ways. But
yeah, and I don't know if you read our colleague Delinda Collier's book, Media Primitivism, but she also talks about technology in Africa, and starts with things like computers, like who has access. So Cho is asking about access, who has access to technology, and in African countries that she studied, they have no access to the same kind of technology that a country like Singapore has. So
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's this big elephant in a room around the entire concept of even exhibition making coming from the global north, and then everything that just goes after that is a legacy of colonialism and everything else. So yeah, I think that question is still very much relevant, not just even in art, but in any other kind of discipline as well. And I'm just very curious, as a biologist first, and when you crossed over to become an artist, what kind of barriers did you have to cross, if there were any?
Oh, wow. So many. I did say that many of my colleagues and my mentor as scientists were practicing artists too, but they did that for their own, pleasure. They didn't exhibit that work necessarily. And to the extent that I saw art as more than a hobby, many of my science colleagues have always been very skeptical and thought it was a little strange. But the same is also true, at the School of the Art Institute of Chicago. I'm one of the few PhD trained, scientists, even though most of my work now isn't in the research sciences. But there's certainly certain artists or art historians in certain cases who think I'm, as the American metaphor, I'm not staying in my lane, driving metaphor. Like, I should stay in my lane. I have a certain training. I have a certain perspective. But I've, of course, gained more training, and I've done a lot of other work. But Nora, you mentioned that in my tenure presentation, I really only talked about the science, and that was by design. There was a curatorial project I had at the University of Illinois Chicago called Bioagents, about bioart. It had Natalie Germanchenko and Brendan Ballinger and some other really interesting artists, but I didn't talk about that because I had been warned by some members of the review committee that I wasn't an artist or a curator, I was a scientist, and so I should only talk about things that I know properly about, or else it could count against me. And so that is a very strong, scolding. That's a huge barrier. And it's still the case that I always often don't feel at home, even though I might be able to both translate and dwell within science communities and art communities, and I speak those languages. I'm often just as much in the middle rather than connected across. There's the other word is interstitial, where you're stuck in between two things. You're not necessarily connecting and bridging them. And even though I bridge them, I think in my own work, in my own sensibility, in my teaching and my research, as a community of people, I'm often actually stuck in the middle, and I think I'm seen as an outsider actually in both of those communities sometimes. So that in itself is a barrier.
Yeah, that's great. Ace brought up colonialism. It's everywhere here in Vietnam. We're former French colony, American invasion and attacks, and imperialism and so forth. But it's interesting when you talk about academic colonialism.
Yeah, right.
So I think that's interesting. And of course, these concepts of hybridity and in-betweenness, etc. So
yeah, and if we end up later having a conversation about coloniality or these other, I wanted to say to Cho, right, the other thing I do think about in terms of technology is infrastructure, not just technology as a device. Globalism and colonialism are technologies in their own right, and I think that gets to Ace's question too, of course, about organized exhibitions, and then the resources and the assumptions that are built into the having an international exhibition, or having and what that necessitates, or even certain curatorial models, like Ace was saying about a Western or Northern kind of point of view about how things should be properly organized, or what it means to curate. And I think all of those things definitely have to be called into question. It's a potent technology, but it's led us to a lot of those technologies have led us, just like the combustion engine, capitalism and fossil fuels as technologies has led us to a precarious place. And so, we need more hybrid, both conceptually and plug-in electric approaches. We need to, think about those metaphors seriously, but we have to think about these infrastructures, or these systems. That's where I definitely do engage the question of technology, but the question of the system, not the level of the system, not the device. And that's where I think it'd be really interesting to talk about coloniality or these other models.
And I think that it speaks so much to us, and it, I recall the very basic the quotes that you cited at the beginning of your presentation by Levi Strauss and Baldwin on just the ability to ask questions. And even when you arrive at a certain kind of answer, you need to go beyond that and then ask more questions. And as we are entangled in this self-institutionalized art world and the art system as a whole, I think we just need to sometimes just stay at the in-between area a little bit, stay out of our comfort zone, and just ask questions. I think that's the key thing.
Yeah, go off into
off
the
tangent.
into the other lane. Like, don't stay in your lane.
Yeah, I think that's the real necessity. But that's what's interesting about academia, and certainly the art world and the science world. They're very conservative, generally speaking, even though they generate a lot of important discovery and innovation. At their core, in terms of their structure, they're actually exceptionally conservative, and that leads to its own problems.
Yeah, thank God you went off course, because that's how you ended up doing this fantastic work. And I think a lot of us who have done that kind of thing, I was told too that I shouldn't study Vietnamese art because there is no such thing.
You
So,
crossed over from
yeah, and I crossed
ethnography.
over. So I crossed over, and
I
there you
crossed
go.
over from
You
business.
yes.
Home crossed over from translation, language studies.
Yeah, we're all crossers overs.
Yeah.
So, are there any last questions, or it's getting late in the evening for you?
No, I'm fine.
Yeah. Okay. Andy, I can't thank you enough. I have the privilege of being able to see you in a few months and continue the conversation. We wish you could come here and see the show and meet everybody. Maybe someday you'll come to
Yeah,
Vietnam.
maybe someday. Well, thank you so much for having me a part of the conversation today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Andrew.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.